All right.
Hi and welcome. My name is Suzanne Lang and I am the director of the Southport CoLab. And with me I have Cadia. Cadia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Cadia Wiley. I am the school counselor at the Southport School.
And we're going to talk this morning about transitions. We're excited to have this conversation. Um, we know that transitions are a really difficult time for a lot of people, especially those who have learning and attention issues. So we're going to start off talking about what is a transition. And we decided to start with this because we know that a lot of times when people think about transition, they think about those major transition points within life. So they'll think about things like when we're transferring from high school to either career or college. And that is a huge transition, and kids with learning and attention issues, especially, have a really difficult time with transitions like that. But they also have difficulty with transitions that happen every day, multiple times throughout the day, much smaller transitions. And if they learn how to manage those transitions, it helps them to then figure out ways to manage the larger transitions. So,
Absolutely.
Claudia, would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, as Suzanne said, transitions look completely different, and what they mean to everybody is completely different as well. So, transitions are really any change that your child goes through that alters any part of their daily life. So, it can be something from, as Suzanne said, a transition from a school to a different school, middle school to high school, elementary school to middle school, or a transition can even be year to year, which also would be kind of considered a bigger transition. But it can also be something that just seems so small. A lot of things that maybe we wouldn't even notice as a transition is something that can impact kids in general, and especially kids with learning and attention issues. So, a transition can be, like I say here, something to a new school, or a transition can be even a topic conversation switch at lunchtime. So it can be that we're talking about our weekend and then somebody switches to what are we going to play at recess. That can be something that kids struggle with being able to keep up with in a conversation. It can take them maybe a minute to even transition to a new conversation. Are they ready to transition to this new conversation? And it is something that can be upsetting. So those are just a couple examples that we'll start out with, but they can be switching class to class. They can be something as small as switching from one station to another in a classroom. So transitions can be something that's really big and obvious to something that's really small that we see our kids struggle with every day. They do happen every day, and the reactions do vary from child to child. So a kid can react from a transition and they may completely shut down. So if we see it sometimes in our classrooms, a kid can shut down between doing some type of hands-on math activity to pencil paper activity. And that shutdown may look like putting their head on the desk or just stop talking. They may have flat affect. It can look very different from kid to kid. Um, and there's different interventions and way to help with that we'll talk about later. Or a transition reaction can look like a very large reaction. It can be a emotional blow up, as we would call it. So it can be that they all of a sudden are fidgeting, or their body is moving a lot and they're really upset by it. They could be verbally using words, they could be raising their voice, they could be storming out of a classroom, or if it's at home, storming out and being upset about it, or really anywhere in between. It can be from the shutdown quiet type of reaction to something a lot larger.
Thank you. So that was really helpful, Kadia, and I think that flows into our next question, which is about the impact of the transition and how it affects different children in different ways. And as you were saying, some kids, um, depending on their personality and I think the type of transition, will
Mhm.
react differently. And I think it's much harder to tell in some kids um, whether whether or not they're having difficulty with the transition because they will do that shutdown, and other kids where they, kind of overreact. It's hard to understand sometimes what the what the reasoning behind it is. So
Absolutely.
I think this is it's really helpful to understand that impact piece.
I think that's really an interesting, what you just said made me think of something. And it sometimes can seemingly come out of nowhere. So the reactions of others around you can either help or exacerbate the situation. And this is why it's good to talk about these things, because sometimes it can seem like it came out of nowhere. But if you know somebody or a kid or anybody really well, you can tell, oh, this is what's going on. We need to maybe do some things to prepare it, which we'll talk about later. But um, some of those impacts is that transitions can really actually be growing opportunities. Transitions aren't going away. So transitions are something that will always be in a kid or adult life. We go through transitions as adults all the time. We transition from one work activity to another. We work in a school, so it's meeting to meeting, classroom to classroom. And those transitions just don't go away. So learning to grow from them is something that's super important, and learning how to kind of handle those is important. It can cause a kid to thrive or struggle. So talking about that thriving piece, sometimes you're transitioning into something you like more. I mean, kids rarely transition poorly to recess, but it can happen. But maybe sometimes it depends on what you're going to that is struggling with your transition, or if you're thriving in your transition. So sometimes we see the struggle coming back in from recess. It can be hard to transition back, not only because maybe you're not stoked about going to class, but also coming down from running around. You have tons of energy flowing right now, and you need to kind of get into a more calm space and body. So those can look very different. And then sometimes you can tell a kid maybe will struggle with someone who's in their class, or there's something going on with a teacher. So there's different scenarios that are going on that could be adding to a kid struggling with a transition or a kid thriving in a transition. They can elicit a variety of emotions, as we talked about. Excitement, they're bounding out to recess, they're ready to get out that energy and have some fun with their friends that they didn't get to see during class time. It can also cause anxiety. Sometimes recess is fun for some kids and it's not fun for others. That's definitely very much a thing. So it takes understanding what's going on with that kid and some of the background knowledge on that scenario that's helpful. It also can cause some sadness. Transition can sometimes be, like we talked about, those big transitions. You're leaving your teachers or school behind. You're having to make new friends, which also can be an anxiety, sadness, or excitement. And it just, again, depends kid to kid on what that's going to look like and what they're leaving behind transition wise. So are you leaving recess behind? Are you leaving a school you loved behind? Or are you leaving a situation where you're like, you know what, I'm ready to move on. I feel prepared. I want that. So there's a lot of different pieces to it that do elicit very different emotions from kids. And these are just three main ones, but there's other emotions that come from transitions as well. These reactions can also manifest in physical ways. So sometimes kids can't put words to it. It's really hard, but they may say, oh, I have a stomach ache. They may say their head is hurting. They might get goosebumps, sweating, heart racing. And those are all reactions from the excitement, the anxiety, the sadness. And it's also kind of speaking to what we talked about a couple minutes ago with, are they shutting down? Is their stomach ache kind of causing them to shut down? And sometimes that's why we see those shutdowns or the emotional blowups, as we call it, because it's them reacting to these physical manifestations of the transitions that are going on.
That's great. Okay. So that really reminds me, as you were talking about that, of an experience that my son had with recess, since you were talking about recess so much, and the anxiety piece. And, my son really had a lot of anxiety for a couple of years in elementary school about recess. Mm-hmm. And the art teacher recognized that and had a program where she allowed one student per classroom to join in the art room during recess, and they rotated out. So they were only allowed to come for 1 week, but he really, really enjoyed that time. It was a smaller group setting, and it was quiet. And so for him, socially and emotionally, it was a much better situation for him, and she recognized that. And I was really grateful because she offered that he could come every week to recess. Every week, instead of going to recess, he could go to the art room. And it really helped him a lot to be able to be in that environment and really reduced his anxiety. So it was very, very helpful. And I know that the next slide, we're going to talk about how to prepare and tackle transitions, and preparing your child for those transitions is really important, and hopefully, both parents and educators will see those opportunities to help those kids. And I know that that's not something that every school can do, and you can't always change situations for your kids.
Right.
But I think, having those conversations and, being open to thinking about what the cause is behind the reaction that that child is having, and
Right.
helping them figure out ways to deal with that. And I know that there are a lot of other ways to deal with that. So, Cadia, maybe you want to talk about those a little bit.
Of course, kind of like what Suzanne said, sometimes we're able to kind of really manipulate a situation to make it better and help kids through tough times, whether it's the kid who's anxious to go to recess and you can, offer something as an alternative, but sometimes we can't fully manipulate the situations and kids have to just do it just like we do as adults. We can't, maybe someone has a tough time and they're not a morning person. Well, most jobs you need to get up in the morning and go to work anyway, so the transition can be tough for people, but we learn to cope and we learn to just kind of get through it. Even if you're never a morning person, you still get up and go to work, and that's something kids have to learn too, with a lot of these things. And sometimes it's good to get to the root cause, because kind of what you were talking about with your son is there was maybe some social anxiety there, so it opened up and kind of shed light on something bigger kind of going on, and it helped you guys kind of unravel that. And that's what we do every day with kids. Sometimes there's really usually underlying reasons why a kid is shutting down or having a emotional reaction to something. There's something going on there, and it takes that conversation and kind of unraveling the situation to see, how can we make this better? Is it a pep talk getting through? Can we manipulate the situation to make it better? There's a lot of different ways to kind of handle these. So some of them are that open and ongoing is key as well. Open and ongoing conversations. What works one day may not work the next. What works one week may not work the next. And also it might be that we're able to manipulate a situation a couple of times, but we can't continuously manipulate situations to make them completely better for kids. So sometimes it's manipulating them a couple of times to make it better, and then kind of talking them through and edging them back into whatever situation they may be being avoidant of or having a hard time transitioning into. So it's honest talks about what is going on. What's the feeling behind there? Are we having that social anxiety? Is there a kid who maybe was unkind to you? Is there something you're stressed about from home? And at home, vice versa. Is there something going on at school that's stressing you out? So it's just having those open conversations. And a lot of kids, especially at our school with learning and attention issues, I have noticed, and teachers use this, other counselors, and I know kids in general benefit from this. A conversation before, during, and after. Once you know somebody struggles with transitions, kind of like an anecdotal story is that we had a student who struggled with big days. So if it was like field day or the Thanksgiving feast you're having at school, or if you're all getting together to do a community project, something like that, those bigger days where it was a disruption in the usual routine, those days were really tough for this student. So it was a conversation the week leading up to, so that before, next week's Thanksgiving, we're having an all school Thanksgiving feast. What is that going to look like? It's talking them through the scenario during the situation. You can have that conversation once. It's whatever the kid may need or what you feel comfortable as an adult thinking they may need. Is it having the conversation the day before, the week before, both, having a conversation a week before and the day before. And then during, checking in on the kid, how's this going? Is this going okay? And then afterwards, debriefing. Was that as scary as we thought it was going to be? Was it even more scary than we thought it was going to be? And that also helps the conversation be ongoing. That's what I mean by ongoing. So now we know that this about that specific student, and that can be something as a parent or as a teacher you can also use. The student struggles with change in routine, so maybe there's going to be a different teacher. That happens. There's substitute teachers. That can be really tough for kids, but it's letting them know as much as we can. And sometimes, people get sick, things happen. So sometimes it's just as much as you can preparing those conversations. That check-in is kind of that during part. Check in. How's it going? Is this, plan we came up with to help you with transitions helping? Is it letting a kid leave class? Like if there's a kid who has a trouble transitioning in the hallways, it's too loud in the hallways. A lot of our kids have a lot of sensory things. It can be tight knit in the hallways. It can be any of those things. And Are they allowed to leave a minute early? Can we manipulate the situation minimally as much, not to disrupt, life and, safety? Are they allowed to be in the hallway alone or whatnot? But what different plans can we make? So whatever plan you have come up with for whatever transition issue is going on, checking in on that plan. Is it still necessary? Is it still even helpful? Those types of things. And normalizing those feelings is super important too. Maybe just because, me transitioning topic to topic isn't a big deal, but that doesn't mean it's not a big deal for the next person. So it's normalizing those feelings. We all have things that cause anxiety in us, and for kids it's the same. Just because one kid doesn't struggle transitioning in a classroom doesn't mean that another kid won't. And it's validating those feelings and letting them know that it's okay to be struggling with that. The second they feel validated, it's a little bit easier to then help them move forward in it. Is it going to be perfect? Not always. So it will take some checking in. It will take maybe manipulating plans a couple of different times, but normalizing those feelings is always step one. Letting them know, I understand what's going on. What can we do now? And working with others. I'm pulled in a lot with classroom things that might be going on with students as a school counselor, but any school personnel, especially at some schools, it can sometimes look like the head of school. It can be a teacher from a different classroom, but sometimes somebody needs like a point person, or even you as an adult trying to help a kid through a transition issue need a point person, somebody to collaborate with and kind of consult with on different things. So it can be school personnel. Sometimes an outside therapist is helpful for this. If this is something that transitions, even with these kind of minimal interventions that we're talking about right now, are not helping, manipulating the situation, creating a plan, talking it through with them, any of those things not helping on kind of a super surface level, then maybe a therapist would be helpful. There are like kids who just have these adjustment issues and need somebody to kind of support them outside of school, outside of their family, a third party person, completely unbiased, to like hear about what's going on with them and help them through it. Friends, they are not alone. Tons of kids struggle with transition. Some of them don't look different. They look different from the next kid, obviously, but having a friend, a buddy talk about those types of things. So if I sometimes know, and I have the permission of a student, oh, well, so-and-so used to struggle with big transitions like Thanksgiving Day. Well, if I had a new student this year who also struggled with Thanksgiving Day, maybe I'd bring in that other student and be like, talk through this situation where you were having trouble with these transitions. Was it as scary as you thought? What helped you? What didn't help you? And hearing from a fellow kid can be helpful also. Adults telling kids what to do all the time can only be so entertaining for them. So sometimes hearing it from another kid is so helpful. Like, here's someone just like me, and they're also having a hard time. Family, whether it's aunts, uncles, cousins, brother, sister, mom, dad, whomever it is, everyone has a lot of parts to play in this. So is it talking through it at the dinner table? Is it kind of going over what's going to happen the next day or whatever? Those types of things can just be really, really helpful in terms of how to handle these ongoing issues with transitions.
That's great. Thank you, Cadia. I just want to comment on a couple of things. I love the before, during, and after, especially the after part, which I think we often forget, because I think having those conversations after the fact helps to then normalize things for kids and helps them to see that this wasn't as scary as I thought, or this wasn't as difficult as I thought. And so you can then refer back to it the next time, and remind them of that as their anxiety starts to peak, or their frustration or anger, or however they're responding to things. So I love
Absolutely.
that. I really love that after part. I think that's really, really important piece of it that we often forget. And I also think, bringing others in and having others have conversations, especially I know it's important to bring in the school personnel, and sometimes a therapist is so helpful. But I love that you included friends, because I think those peer-to-peer relationships can really help, again, to normalize things and make kids feel like they're not so alone and so different from everybody else. And family, the more we work together as families, the better off we are. And
Absolutely.
so I really like those pieces, and I think those are things we often forget about. So thank you. I felt like this was really helpful for me, so I hope it's helpful for everyone else.
Mhm.
And thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much.